we meet again.
We meet again. How are you, Tim?
I'm good. I'm really sorry that the West Coast trip didn't line up for us to get together, but the LA sprawl can be completely unbeatable when you've got a 2-hour round trip to get across town.
Yeah, no, it's all good. I'm sure I'll be back. I make occasional trips there because I'm in San Fran and Redwood City occasionally. So whenever I'm there, I try to make an effort just to go for a day or two. So I'm sure there'll be
Once
next time.
once you've crossed the country, it's an easy jaunt getting down here. Yeah.
How have you been?
Good, good. How about yourself?
Doing great. Been great. Just keeping busy with work, and that's about it. That's life.
We've been coping with some rain here in Southern California, but it's always, in spite of the mudslides, it's always sort of a pleasant change of pace to go from sunshine to actual weather. So I guiltily enjoyed all of the like downpour for the past few days.
Yeah, but some parts got hit really bad, right? Like I think I was reading Hollywood Hills and
Yeah,
certain
a lot of the
areas.
canyons had, some slides. There were over
Yeah.
400 mudslides around the area. And of course, some of those are, pretty benign, but some took out homes. So it's scary. It's a desert. It's not really designed for 7 inches of rain in 2 days.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I hope everybody stays safe and I hope everything remains well with you and your family as well.
It's all good with us. Thanks.
Good, good. Well, good to have you again. We're going to chat about Sinbad, Legend of Seven Seas. I saw it again this morning after a long time, probably a good 18, 19 years, I would imagine. And it's still for me, Sinbad is quite interestingly special to me in a way which I never realized until the film came out. Was when I was a kid, probably I'm willing to bet 7, 8 years of age, back home in Pakistan. And we used to have these cassette tapes where we would just listen to these stories like Tarzan and Sinbad in our native Urdu language. And I remember that one of the stories was Sinbad. And I remember the eagle and all that. And they used to have these
Ah,
sound effects of the eagles and everything. And then watching Jack and the Giant Killer and Sinbad and Seventh Voyage. So there's all that connection until the film came out. I didn't realize how much I have sort of grown up with it, but then kind of stopped watching or listening to those. So it was a very interesting thing when it came out. And even this morning when I was watching it, all those sort of things kind of resurfaced. What was your experience in the very beginning? Like, how did you get on board Sinbad? Aside, DreamWorks is DreamWorks, where you everybody's working and you have different projects that come about. How did your sort of journey begin on that project?
it was a project in full production when I joined.
Okay.
And it had run into sort of a tone and story conundrum. The impulse at DreamWorks was always to go for a pretty zany, broad social commentary style of comedy, and yet here was Sinbad with its roots, as you've already said, so richly in a more traditional, if not almost ancient, cultural take on classic heroism adventure stories. Um, and that's, of course, what I found, and I think the audiences that discovered the film loved about the film, is it really kind of celebrates in what I would say is a fairly old-fashioned way, including in at the time an old-fashioned media drawn animation at the time where computer animation was truly soaring into theaters with lots of different interesting, groundbreaking, visually exciting products. And along comes Sinbad, a traditionally animated movie on a traditional, literary source, and frankly, with a fairly traditional take on, let's tell a rollicking adventure. And so um, I got involved when it just became really apparent that trying to impose too wacky a comedy or too irreverent a comedy or too socially contemporary a comedy was going to sink the tone of the movie. Um, and so joining Patrick Gilmore to work with him to direct the movie, we 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 had an incredible third act storyboarded when I joined, and it was about earning the third act that made the sort of story true up, and throwing out some of the wackier, sillier elements, and really just honoring the idea that this was a scoundrel who learned to be a good man and had a
Mm,
genuine sort of soul a mirroring moment where he decided he didn't want to be that guy anymore, and he was willing to be a hero that would sacrifice. So these are some of the same things, by the way, that I think made it struggle at the box office. It was an old-fashioned story in a medium that was no longer, sizzling hot. Um, and it really was a very sincere movie. I mean, if you just watched it this morning, you know it's almost achingly sincere as compared to overly glib or self-mocking. Which is unusual for a DreamWorks movie, even at that time in those early days.
Yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned the last act, which I thought was great because it had a great message. I mean, especially um, what the doing the right thing. And I felt, and I wasn't trying to look into it too much, but I just felt, and now that you mentioned that you kind of came in the last act, that the first two acts, they had its moments. There were some good, great elements in there in terms of story, but I think there was a lot of like that edgy dialogue, like wacky dialogue, and I think that tone because the film became a little bit more serious in the last act, and wonder if that's
Yeah.
what you just said, right? Because that maybe the fact that it didn't match the first two acts in terms of that tone, like Prince of Egypt, it didn't do great at the box office, but that tone stayed consistent.
Yeah, very much
And
so. I mean,
yeah,
I think boy, I wish I had like the story screenings for when I first joined, because it was pretty outrageous, the first two acts, and yet the third act was more or less what you see in the film. I mean, refined and improved by the process, but um, I'm not surprised that you felt on a recent viewing that it still had a sort of huge shift as got to its sincere ending. Trust me, that shift would have been seismic if we hadn't learned what we did and sort of try to true it up. So, um, but it was an interesting like storytelling learning curve for me to try to do those balancing acts. And even though I think you're right that it's still a little jarring to get into the self-confessional breakdown Sinbad goes into, it's still, I feel like we got it across the hump, so to speak, of you believing it and rooting for Sinbad to make that change, which when it was really glib, you actually didn't want him to change. Like he was a bit of a clownish character, and you were like, oh, I don't even buy that he would do this, and I'm not sure I want him to. So getting to a place where we could earn the epiphany was the biggest story sort of journey of that film.
yeah. And I didn't realize until again this morning that it came out the same year. I'm guessing it was a summer release, as Pirates of the Caribbean did. The
Did
original Pirates of,
I would say we had a box office perfect storm. It was begun, the film in like 1999. And so the perfect storm for us is, we weren't the fresh pirate movie we wanted to be, because Parts of the Caribbean beat us, into the theaters. We were, frankly, we were post 9/11. Nobody wanted to hear stories from the Middle East. It was
yeah,
just not a vibe Americans were comfortable with, spending their ticket dollars on. We were, again, a drawn film rather than CG, which was really considered groundbreaking and visually innovative. And we really were we were trying to, if anything, we were looking at movies like Indiana Jones that had an old-fashioned sense of
yeah.
adventure and an exotic quest. Um, but all of it just added up to a real box office struggle for the film. It just was not on. You talk about films that either get lucky with the zeitgeist and then sometimes ones that don't. And we were just really unlucky with all of the different cultural and film trend moments of its time when it was released.
Yeah. So have you read it's part of I think it's called Arabian Nights like 1000 or something. I think the title is
A Thousand
1000
One,
Nights.
yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
the source material, you mean?
Yeah. Have you read the original source material or did you read it at the time or was it
Uh,
something that
I-
anybody
I'd read
referenced
it.
to?
I'd read it several times before. I was a literature major, and I loved, especially even even going back to translated works. I loved ancient works, so I spent my time in literature reading Beowulf and Icelandic sagas
Mm.
and the Arabian Nights and the that sort of earliest cultural attempts from around the world to codify what heroism is and the relationship between men and the gods. And so I loved those kind of stories. And it's why when Jeffrey said the film needs to be sort of trued up, would you join it as a director and join Patrick? I was really excited to because I just loved Sinbad. I loved the story. I loved The Rock. And in fact, I was all in college. I was a very passionate Dungeons and Dragons player and DM'd a game which I kept having The Rock appear as a villain, sort of a recurring. So I was already sort of steeped in a bit of the lore and a fan of the source material, and uh, and and frankly a fan of all the things that I just said. Sort of killed it at the box office.
Yeah. Yeah, and kind of going up on to the animation of it, I think obviously, we all know that one of the most difficult things in animation, at least at the time, it may be true now, but not as much as it was back then, is that water sequences, right? Like, and this whole film pretty much takes place, almost
Yeah.
70% of it on the sea. But what I thought was interesting, and I was wondering when I was watching it this morning, is that there was a sequence where Sinbad, and what's her name? The character that's played by Catherine Zeta-Jones,
Marina.
Marina. They're on the desert, and this desert kind of flows like a water, and a shipwreck comes in. And I was wondering when I was watching, I'm like wondering, was that something that was really challenging to do in terms of the animation at the time?
Overall, it 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 was probably the hardest film I worked on, including the ones that I didn't direct that I was involved with,
Mm.
because it was sort of the state of the art of both mediums at the time for those mediums. I would argue that you can't find a better hand drawn film than Sinbad. Human figures with subtle acting, moving slowly, where the architecture, just the sheer drafting of a human face, we're awfully sensitive to the details of a human face, and the uncanny valley awaits if things swim or don't move right. And our animators on that were just astonishingly gifted at the traditional art of drawn animation. But then, in order to do the water or the sand, or a lot of the effects around Eris, the goddess of chaos, the Michelle
Mm.
Pfeiffer character, we used a lot of computer animation effects and imagery. Jeffrey coined a term that I was never in love with at the time, but looking back, I think it was pretty accurate. Prodigital. Traditional plus digital. Tradigital was very
Mm.
much kind of whether I like the term or not, it was the marching order of the pictures. How can we take the best of both worlds to create these exotic locations and these compelling, very relatable characters, and just really cherry pick from what the state of the art of these two disparate mediums were and try to make them cohere into one seamless medium experience for audiences, which I would say, I think even looking back on it, we did fairly successful. I think visually the film still stands up as a really lovely blend of a lot of different creative energies, voices, and techniques.
Yeah. The tradigital, the word that you just used, or Katzenberg used, for me, I think even when the film came out, I couldn't put my finger on it. But again, watching it this morning, I think the snow sequence with the eagle and all that, that was
Yeah.
beautiful. Like the blend was absolutely beautiful. For me, that didn't sort of work in the beginning, the octopus sequence,
Mm.
where the blend, it was just it. I know, I get it. Like, computer animation is very different than traditional, and it stood out, which made it look great. That, wow, this is like looks so real. But at the same time, it just, for me, it didn't work because it looked, again, computery, and the worlds weren't really aligning for me. Was that something ever, at the time, part of a conversation, or that at that time it was like, wow, this is amazing?
A little bit of both, honestly. I was worried, and my suspicion is what didn't work for you is the level of complicated texture mapping on our sea monster,
Mm.
which which is such a complete giveaway that it's not drawn, that it creates a huge barrier between, well, why is this octopus covered with an enormously gorgeous patterned flowing, but then fabrics don't have that on the human characters. Do you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah,
you
yeah, it makes
if you're
sense.
going to have, elaborate patterned textures, well, don't just give it to the one CG element in there. And so I was worried, and we did some tests of more simplified, but it sort of lacked the grandeur when it was too simplified.
Yeah.
And in spite of my and Patrick's reservations, and Ramon, our art director, it everybody sort of enjoyed the largeness of the sea monster due to those sort of textures. So it's funny now you've seen such incredibly interesting blends, including Nimona, the recent film that premiered this year on Netflix, both of those Sony Spider-Man movies, where they're taking from traditional drawn animation looks and cell animation colors and flatness and edges in a way that I think is really interesting and mostly successful. And some of the reasons I think they're pulling it off is they're very careful with the texturing that they use to not, I think, do what we did, which is kind of betray the complexity of CG's visual language, and create a sort of a jarring juxtaposition.
Yeah. And the sequences, there's a sequence which I really liked, the way the camera moved. This is just a comment. When the goddess pretends to be Sinbad and she comes to steal the book, and the camera, I'm not sure when was the last time you've seen it, but there's all these pillars and the camera kind of just moves diagonally downward like on a crane kind of an approach, and it just looked, the blend of that and the texture of that looks so phenomenally great even to this day. Like that
Oh,
was
that's nice to
just,
hear.
that was really really cool. I went back and saw it a couple of times. I mean, it lasts like 5 seconds, not even, but it was just so beautifully done.
No, thank you. It's lovely to hear, and especially to hear when things sort of survive what's been now 20 years of leaps and advances across all medium of film, live action and Marvel movies. And so, the the challenge of the movie was sometimes to make sure, to balance the majesty of sets and locations and the magic of the ocean and the desert, but with keeping intimate with the characters. So the rule of thumb we had is, when you've got a close up, let's make sure it doesn't do quick cuts. Let's let close ups linger, and let's let them be as close as we can get with drawn animation, which frankly is about where our zoom windows are now, sort of sternum up. If you get too much closer than that in drawn animation, you start to run into some problems. And so we were constantly going back and forth between how do we celebrate the environment with you know David Lean largesse,
Mm.
with how do we make sure we're inside the heads of these characters. And so it was strange to use films like David Lean movies. It sounds very pretentious to look at those gorgeous movies in Lawrence of Arabia as a reference, but David Lean did that so wonderfully. Lawrence of Arabia in particular, those close-ups are stunning, and the actors hold the camera beautifully, and they communicate as great film actors do, with incredible subtlety and rich vision into what they're thinking. And then the next shot might be this insane vista that's a 15-mile horizon over the oceanic sands. And so we loved looking at those examples of intimate stories and grand landscapes to try to capture some of that for the film.
Yeah, and in most cases it did. And I think the reason in some cases it didn't is because of what we talked about earlier, is the story being too wacky in the beginning and not so much in the last chapter. But there was that level of grandness in there for sure. Even like what was that sequence where they're on an island, but it's not an island, and
Yeah,
the monster opens its eyes, and that whole sequence and then the escape from there was just so amazing. Like, and the music does a great job too, right? That really carries certain
yeah.
sequences. Yeah.
Harry
Uh,
Gregson Williams,
yeah.
you know, I had a sort of sad laughter with him at the end. I said, "Listen, the only good news about Sinbad not doing great is that whenever you temp a movie, which is common in movies, you make a movie, you do a rough cut, and then you usually temp the soundtrack by
Yeah.
stealing from other movies." And I said, Harry, you're going to beat on everybody's temp score because nobody saw Sinbad. Nobody's going to recognize your music, and everyone's going to love this heroic, vibrant soundtrack. I think some of the themes in Sinbad still sort of hold up as good or better than anything in film composition because he captured exactly what we were talking about visually: grandiosity and enormous scale with intimacy and a sense of what the characters are thinking.
It's funny you mentioned that because I similar Road to El Dorado, which came out a few years before that, had a similar fate as Sinbad, probably not as bad. Because the story in terms of it was two
Yeah.
wacky characters and you couldn't figure out if it was a serious movie or not. And it had a great score as well by Hans Zimmer. Like there
Yeah.
was this track, and I have used a lot of those tracks from Road to El Dorado as temp tracks because nobody knows about the film and nobody
It's
knows
a,
about the soundtrack.
it was the most backhanded compliment I could have given Harry. The congratulations, you're going to be temped everywhere. So,
You were talking about David Lean and Lawrence Arabia, and I want to go back to you've seen Sinbad Seventh Voyage of Sinbad?
oh,
The
sure. Yeah.
so there was that one-eyed monster with the little horn
Cy-
sticking out.
the Cyclops.
Yeah. What in your I know you came later in the film, but in based on what you had seen in terms of storyboards, even in the early versions of it, were there any kind of uh storyboards or references to the original Sinbad or trying to have that kind of an approach, or was it something
It was almost the opposite, Jawad.
okay.
It was almost trying to avoid it, you know. And so if it was too iconic, and we felt like let's not compete with Ray Harryhausen. Let's
Mm,
in some ways we wanted to make sure that we weren't I don't know, trying to one up with new technology, the gorgeous stop motion work that Harryhausen had done. And so, the great thing about the original source material is there's so many different amazing narrative and character moments that it was pretty easy to, let me just silence this.
no problem.
It was pretty easy to pick and choose from the source material what monsters, adventures, locations, and not have a lot of overlap with the Seven Voyages.
Yeah. That's good. That's good to know. Uh, you know, it's just like any film, especially with animation, there's a lot of test screenings, right? Like you
Yeah.
go through like, okay, what to do, what not to do, what to take out. With animation, it's a little bit different than live action because live action you can go and reshoot, not relatively fast, but faster than an animation because then you may have to draw or do a whole sequence or a scene altogether. What do you remember the time when you guys realized that the response from the audience at any stage in the screenings is not coming across? Was there a time like that?
Well, we had so a couple things. Back to your first observation, in many
Sure.
ways, test screens for animation are way easier to make changes than live action.
Really? Okay.
Listen, it's so live action is so expensive that to get
Sure.
a crew and a location to get your cast who are probably off shooting something else back in and hope that they haven't changed their hairstyle or it's actually
True.
painfully expensive and you got to go beg the studio for money. When we test a movie in animation, we frequently test it way before it's finished. So huge sequences are still in storyboard and therefore very inexpensive to add a line, change
Makes
energy,
sense.
make big cuts or changes. So the testing process, I would say, with animation is actually even more rigorous and painful as a filmmaker. And you're really able to learn which jokes land, which don't, how to make them land, if they're worth preserving, how to cut them, which sequences need a different change of pace, which plot points or exposition points need more time to land. So that testing process, I feel I don't remember specifically with Sinbad, but it would be typical for us to go through five or more tests of the film in various stages. The latter tests, and certainly the last test, your film is mostly done, and at that point, the test is really just for the marketing people. So they're looking at it from a studio sales point of view to go, what's an audience responding to, so we know how to position the picture and cut a trailer together and whatnot. But on the other side of this is the strange, difference between box office performance and audience reaction. We had enormous good scores out of our test screenings.
Hmm.
Um, so it's one of those cases, which is not uncommon, where you have a film that when audiences see it, they love it and they give it a good cinema score. The exit interviews are really big. But getting an audience to buy the ticket was the challenge with Sinbad. So the good news is our, in some ways our word of mouth saved us from an even more disastrous because the people who saw it liked it and talked about it. And even to this day, I'm always honored when somebody has discovered the film and enjoys the story and loves the techniques. But this was one where I won't say we were blindsided by the failure of the box office. We sort of knew it was looming. Marketing people had done their sort of tests and shown trailers, and just nothing was really clicking with an audience such that they knew, like, okay, this is going to catch a wave of audience interest. It really on its. I think our opening weekend was 17 million, maybe less, and it
Yeah.
just really never caught fire.
Yeah. And the thing is, with any film, it's one thing to make it, and you and I talked about this earlier about ants. It's easy to make a film, but it's hard to sell it, right? And
Well,
and
I would say it's more painful to sell it. Making a film is delightful but hard. Selling a film is both hard and painful.
yeah, maybe those are the right words. Like, you at least enjoy the process of making a film. But selling it, whether even if it's, in this day and age where everything is digital and there's so many platforms, it's still hard because there's so much noise, there's so much stuff out there. So what I was going to ask you is that marketing. One thing I learned so much from DreamWorks when I was running the website was I was just fascinated by the way DreamWorks marketed its film, from 1997 onwards. And obviously there were some misses, here and there. And would it be fair to say that sometimes the marketing team, not just at DreamWorks anywhere, doesn't really they don't know how not they don't know how to sell it, but they just don't know who the audience would be because that's a big thing too. Was there any kind
Yeah.
of questions at the time the film was done when they were putting the trailers together and marketing material? Okay, we don't know how to sell this film. Like, what is this? Was there any conversation like that?
It's a bit of a trope for the directors and creatives to complain about
I'm not saying that. I'm
the
just
fools in
talking
marketing.
yeah.
But I would say that on Sinbad, it was I really respect and had great successes in many ways with the marketing department. Terry Press, I think at the
I
time
was
was
gonna
head of
say her
marketing.
name. Yeah, yeah, she was
Yeah, and
fabulous.
Terry's a kind of brilliant. But I feel like with Sinbad, they really pushed the comedy and less the story. And even I was disappointed that we didn't really push the exoticness of locations or the beauty of these techniques that were sort of fresh and to grab an audience. So when they showed us the poster, I remember the art director was almost in tears and left the room because it was like, that's not the movie we made.
Mm,
We wanted something that was just a little more exotic and a little more mature in our marketing. And we felt like this was being marketed to our youngest audience members as a silly movie about a pirate dog. Like it was just all about Spike the dog and all the marketing stuff. Um,
yeah.
so I now that being said, I don't know that there was a more sophisticated or grown older audience, leaning. I really genuinely feel like we were the victim of that perfect storm we talked about, of a bunch of
Mm,
forces outside our control. And while I wish that we had had the courage to market the film with a little more sort of aggression in its belly, I can't blame the marketing department for Sinbad's
yeah.
performance.
No, no, absolutely not. And I'm glad you mentioned Terry Press because she is such a force even to this day. Working with Spielberg, Sam Mendes, she has her own consulting firm and everything. And I even remember reading about the movie The Island, the Michael Bay one, the one that he made with DreamWorks. And for a Michael Bay movie, it tanked at $14 million opening.
Yeah.
And Michael Bay blamed the marketing department, but Terry Press said that we just couldn't figure out what to like. Even if I showed the trailer to the island to the kids the other day, and they're like, "What the hell is this movie about? I can't figure it out." But
Yeah.
that's going to what Terry Press was saying, that she was truly a genius, and she is, because she's very blunt and she says it as it is, and because that's her job. She's supposed to sell the film, and if people don't like it, then they don't like it, right? That's
Yeah, I adore her. I think she's a force of nature, and she is
yeah,
blunt. Boy, but but her job is to take a creative product and make it an event, because these films cost a lot of money and they need
yeah.
a certain event scale perception in the world to be successful. And when they are successful, they are an event. Prince of Egypt was a modest success, but it was an event. I mean,
It was a
you knew
massive
it.
event. Yeah.
Yeah. And Ants was a much more modest promotional budget, and because it was a less expensive film, it actually was incredibly profitable. And and in a proportionate to that film, Terry and team were able to make it an event. We're using mostly the voices as a reason to say you can't miss this. And then later films, I mean, I feel like Terry probably wasn't there for Over the Hedge, and she wasn't there for Home, but both of those were, I think, cunningly marketed. And while I had furious arguments at the time, I can't argue with the results, which were, yeah, we were able to get above the sea of competing voices with those. Sinbad, though, never really got above the sea of voices. I do think, as you mentioned, we were drowned out by Pirates of the Caribbean. Just it, it, Pirates of the Caribbean is a cool movie. It's full of cool people with
Yeah.
cool set pieces, and had, I would say, in an era that didn't do this very often, a very meta sense of itself. It was winking at the camera. I mean, I think one of my favorite lines is when Jack Sparrow, sort of cheats at a sword fight. Somebody says, "You're cheating." He goes, "Pirate?" Like, what do you not get about a pirate? And so that sort of knowingness made it very contemporary, hip, and cool. And in spite of our attempt to have, kind of irreverent humor and a rollicking good time and voices like Brad Pitt and Michelle Pfeiffer, we just were never cool. And being cool is one of the ways you pop above the fray.
Yeah. Yeah. And 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 one of the things that I've read, and I don't know if it's 100% accurate, so please tell me if you, even if you know this, is that so the thing is, DreamWorks, I'm kind of talking this about a big picture now, was soaring from the day it started, like, to Saving Private Ryan, Prince of Egypt,
Yeah.
Ants, Amistad, like Gladiator, American Beauty. I mean, there were just like hits after it, almost
Yeah.
famous, like Oscar nominations, Shrek. And then from what I have read, just like any other company, when you start off, you have all these bold decisions that you take chances, and then when you become bigger and when there's stocks and all that stuff, then the decision making becomes a little bit challenging because there's all these other people that are invested their money. And Sinbad, from what I have read, kind of became the last step to the fall of DreamWorks as a studio, and financially at least. Is that fair to say? Again, I just read this on a few publications online.
It was definitely, for all the successes DreamWorks had up through, 2003, it was still a very expensive studio to run, and every movie had to perform. When you're only making a couple of animated films a year, and even making two was hard then.
Yeah.
You're pouring the energies of hundreds of people, and all the costs associated with a business, and frankly, it's a very expensive business because salaries are high. People make a good wage in the talent pool of animation. So in spite of the successes, when Sinbad failed, I don't think we ever got to the studio's in danger of shuttering, but it did put a wrinkle in, like, going public and other sort of ambitions of the studio, or going up to two or three films a year. Sinbad was definitely a pothole in the road, and the first really largish one, in spite of some disappointing, performance in other films.
Do you remember the aftermath of the opening weekend, like having a conversation with the team or Jeffrey or your
Yeah, though it's
co-director or the end?
it's funny. The thing I I remember the two conversations with Jeffrey. The first was on opening day on Friday. He sat me down. I think Patrick and Murray, my directing partner and producer, he sat the three of us down and he goes, uh, I'm always an optimist. I love this movie. I hope we're going to be surprised, but I've just seen all of the most latest market research. I think we're going to have a, a challenging weekend. So
Mm,
he sort of laid the groundwork for I think we're going to struggle. Um, and then the call on Sunday morning after we really struggled, he's like, I'm sorry, it's just really the audience is not there for us this weekend. And I remember I told him, I think we just threw this party and nobody attended. And he goes, that's exactly how it feels. Like we threw a party, a birthday party, and nobody came. And so it was a
mm,
dark weekend. You don't, it's funny, I don't feel like I do am motivated and driven by the idea of box office, but I'm very motivated by the idea of a family with popcorn in their lap and their eyes on the screen. Like that's an astonishing responsibility and compliment and gift to tell a story and then have not just anybody, but a whole family of all ages enjoy it. And I felt with Sinbad, we had made an incredibly enjoyable film for all ages, and it just had very few people see it compared to the expectation. And that was, the later on as it became clear that, okay, studio's going to have to like reset some ambition because we lost money on this film. Only later did the actual kind of money side of it hit me, but just the idea that we had not grabbed butts in seats like we were all hoping for people to enjoy the film was pretty bitter.
yeah. What's the most proudest thing from that film that if you look back at right now that you feel like that was something that we did was great?
I
Could
mean,
be a scene.
there's a lot of things I love about it. I mean, I love Brad Pitt's performance and working with him to craft that character um, was a really exciting journey. He, like a lot of actors, especially at the time, had never done an animated
Animation.
character,
Yeah.
and like a lot of actors, he fell in love with it after initial hesitation. I mean, you're saying to a guy like Brad Pitt, who's obviously just a stunning leading man of a on-screen presence, and you're going to say we're going to take away a, all of the tools that are visual and leave you only with your audio, with your voice. And that's just daunting. It'd be like sending a clarinetist on stage and half his valves don't work. So you've taken away notes that he knows he can play beautifully. But
Mm,
at the same time, for Brad and for many other actors I've worked with, it becomes this exciting challenge and awakening to the power they have as a great performer in their voice. So I would say that was one of the biggest things. I do feel like there's a couple of sequences in there. I love the Sirens sequence as the men of the ship are wooed by the watery
mm,
sirens. I love the rock sequence. I feel like with the action scenes, they came together really sophisticated visually and filmically, and I think they hold up in a way that I'm always be proud of. Um, and mostly what I remember and proud of in the film are the things that an audience never got to see. The incredible joy of working with traditional animators, drawn animation, their talent, their humility, and the power they could bring and the ideas they brought. My favorite moments of the film aren't on screen. They're laughing in a room full of people
of
as we
course.
enjoy, the discovery of the storytelling and the animation.
Yeah, that's true. That's so true. Do you think if Sinbad was to be released as a series now, do you think it would work?
I I don't know. If anything, we're living in an even more meta age, meaning I don't think it would work. I think it would suffer from some of the same issues that we've discussed, which
Mm,
is you you either do it as a dark drama and really pour that on, or you go a little more irreverent and a little more Pirates of the Caribbean, a little more knowing, winking, outrageous with it. Um, but we tried to have our cake and eat it too in a way that I think is entertaining to watch, but feels old fashioned. And if you were going to do it today, The source material, of course, is still and always will be just wondrous in the true definition of wonder, like jaw-dropping set pieces and great classic heroic
Yeah.
characters. So I would say that absolutely, there's a version of Sinbad and A Thousand One Nights that you could do today that would be incredible. But I don't think you could just transplant what we did with our DreamWorks
Yeah.
Sinbad to today without a serious reinvention.
I have always wondered, up until Clash of Titans remake came out with was it Sam Worthington, I think was in
Yeah,
it. The
yeah.
yeah. Um I always wanted to see a new version of Sinbad just because, my childhood connection. And it's funny, aside from the animation film, nobody has tried it. I just find it interesting that in the time where remakes are being made over and over again, nobody has tried to make that film.
I I completely agree. If I were to take another stab at it in today's world, I would very much go back to the source material. And the the core of the Arabian Nights is a story about storytelling.
Yeah.
It's a woman keeping herself alive through the power of narrative and dropping a complete, uh, who done it, page turning, open-ended moment at the end of every story so that she could live another day to come back and tell the next chapter. And so I love that in the source material is this comment on storytelling and the power of narrative to save her life. And here within that are the stories of Sinbad, this episodic set of escalating adventures. So I share your puzzlement. It's one of the richest and stood the test of time, sources of the art of storytelling. Somebody will find a way to master it for a contemporary attempt.
Yeah, I hope so because I would love to see that. Aside from Sinbad, I mean, there's so many stories in there. Aladdin being one of them, of course, right? Which
Yeah.
Katzenberg did at Disney. Um, but uh, but yeah, no, this has been great. Thank you, Tim. Unless you want to add something, I mean, I've pretty much exhausted all my conversations about the Sinbad. But if you have anything to add, I would love to hear.
The only thing I'm hoping is that your own nice words about it and our conversation lead people to continue to discover the film. It's one of the many joys of animation is in some ways they don't suffer the same fate of a live action film where suddenly a hairstyle is completely out of style from a previous era.
Yeah,
And even though animation has matured and changed and technology, there is something timeless about every animated film where they can be enjoyed decades after they're made, and you're not sort of hit in the face with the era it was made. So I love that we got a chance to talk about it, and then maybe we'll grab a few more eyes on the picture, which really does deserve to be seen for family audiences from here on.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And it's so true about animated films being timeless because I mean, I remember in the 90s I used to watch all the old Disney flicks like Fox and the Hound, Robin
Yeah.
Hood, Jungle Book was one of my favorite. And they're still relevant today, and that's the beauty of animation and you enjoy it.
My
And I yeah,
Yeah, my favorite anime film of all time is still Dumbo, which is what year was that made? 1940,
41,
41,
41. Yeah.
and it's got one of the most wonderful silent main characters. It's got a complete drug
True.
induced dream sequence in it. It's got a
Yes.
mother's separation story that is heartbreaking. It's just interesting when animation works well. It achieves a classic, timeless sense of story that really it goes back to um, the Arabian Nights and Aesop's fables. It taps in as a medium into classic storytelling of exotic, impossible to achieve visuals with talking animals and things that only animation still can do as better than anything any live action filmmaker can dream up.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Dumbo because all those classic films that are being now remade into live action, I haven't seen a single one of them, and I do not want to. Maybe
Wow.
they're great, but I just don't want to because that to me is the real storytelling.
I agree. I feel like the reason to remake a movie creatively is because it needs to speak to a changed time in a changed way.
Yeah,
And if you're not going to do that, if you're really going to duplicate rather than innovate, I just kind of scratch my head. And it's
yeah,
comical that, like, I think it was Clint Eastwood said, Hollywood's the only industry ever that doesn't remake and try to improve what didn't work. They just keep making what did work again and again. And
yeah.
so it's, yeah, it's an odd one. I would put as candidates for a new movies remakes a bunch of movies I've seen that I think were kind of brilliant but deeply flawed and could be done better. Those would be better candidates to be remade than taking
100%.
classics that are near to perfect and trying to, I don't know, improve them, I guess. It seems pretty cynical.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, Tim. Pleasure talking to you. Would love to chat with you in future as usual. And thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Great to talk to you.
Take care. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. And do come back for another episode. Until then, have a great day.